Let's talk. So, if you are on social media in the SCA right now, like I am, probably every third post, if it's a quiet day, is talking about Gulf Wars. And one of the often repeated mantras that come with this is this verbiage of "we are going to war," war, we're heading to the war is great. It's part of the nomenclature and the verbiage of the SCA. It's not just Gulf Wars, though. If you do hear talk of war or Gulf, or if you do hear talk of war, chances are I'd say about 50-55% someone's either talking about Gulf Wars or Pennsic, the two biggest in the society. But I wanted to talk about the nomenclature of events because you really hear about events and then you hear about wars and what's the difference between these two and what are they talking about. So let's just kind of start at the basics. An event, to be broad about it, is any activity hosted by an SCA group for the general SCA. Generally speaking, an event is something where a local group, or possibly several local groups, will host an event at a specific location. People will show up, sign in at gate, possibly pay, and will take part in the event for the day. Now, events are important for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're a source of revenue for the SCA, and that is how, even though we are not for profit, that's a huge portion of how we get revenue for maintenance and upkeep of our kits, of the group pavilions, of loaner armor, sometimes garb, all of the trappings and accoutrements that help make the game cool for us at a local level. They're also important because court, keep in mind, all awards have to be given out in court. Courts can only be held if they have been scheduled in advance. There has to be an announced court. You can't just open a court in the middle of the week without warning. It has to be announced ahead of time. That's part of the requirements of the royalty, or placed on the royalty. And the overwhelming majority of courts are held, almost all of them are held at events. So a scheduled event is a venue where royalty or nobility may open court and do what they do, recognize and inspire the populace. Now, the overwhelming majority of events, when we say event, is some sort of local event. And in broad terms, there are two types of events here in Onstera. You have local, a local event, the classic event where you have tournaments and an arts science competition, and people get together, they camp. There's a feast. A pretty typical template for an SCA event. And then you also have collegiums, which is, again, broad terms, and I'm using big broad brush here when I speak like this. And a collegium is traditionally a day event, which is all day of classes. You show up early, you gate in, and then it's hour or 2 hour blocks of class. It's a college effectively, just to go to classes all day. Are there some camping collegiums? Yes, there are. They're few and far between, but they do exist. Most events try and be multi-day, though since COVID, a lot of them have gone to day events. We're shifting. I don't think right now is a really good measure of what the average is or will be. But generally speaking, events are multi-day, or probably are heading back to being multi-day things, and collegiums tend to be one day. Then you have wars. What is a war? So the word, of course, war talks about a major conflict. In the SCA, through the lens of the SCA, a war is a medium to large event centered around some sort of orchestrated conflict. It's effectively, wars are almost always some sort of melee event, whether that is rapier or light weapons melee, or much more common chivalric melee events. Wars tend to be larger than other events and tend to be multi-group events, where, for example, the Barony of Wiesenfeuer will have its event, its baronial championship, which is a standard camping event with a heavy weapons tournament, a rapier tournament, an archery tournament, and so on and so forth. When there is a war that is traditionally several groups coming together to host a war, and they will rally sides to fight into for people to come and fight with. I remember one group used to do Battle of Three Kings, which went on to become three commanders, then three centurions. But the whole point there was they would pick historical conflicts and use those historical events as this rough template for some sort of full day 3-team melee event. I remember my first one was the Scottish War for Independence, and we all I fought on the side of the Scots. Even though I'm English, just a little side story here. I was like in the early phases of dating my now wife, and she's Scottish, so you're going to ask me which side I'm fighting for. Yeah, so I fought for the Scots at that one. And we won, by the way. We cleaned the other side's clock so many times it's not funny. But moving on. Some wars are really big. They are inter-kingdom wars. You'll have one kingdom will declare war on another, and that will in reality turn into they'll pick some site that is usually near the border, and both sides will send huge contingents of troops and people acting in support role, water bearers, camp tenders, and so forth. And I don't use those terms lightly. When you get to major inter-kingdom events, Gulf Wars being one of the more extreme examples, there are times where you will have people who are going to war. Their entire purpose there is to watch the camp and to cook, one or two of the meals that week. And that's a full-time obligation. And outside of that, they have a few hours to do their own thing. But, when you're getting into wars, you're getting into levels of, tends to be levels of organization and levels of commitment that are truly out of the ordinary when compared to regular events. Now, does that mean that if you go to war, you're going to be obligated to do something? It's like getting conscripted in the army? No, not at all. If you want to go to Gulf and just wander around and have fun, you absolutely can. My point is that if there's a group of people from your area going to Gulf Wars or Pennsic, there is a very good chance, if it's a larger contingent that does this regularly, you're going to hear talk of people saying, "Oh, she's the camp mom that day," or "She's in charge of the kitchen that day," or "Hey, who's in charge of making sure there's propane for the bathhouse?" It's much more organized, and it's usually centered around supporting the fighters so that the fighters are free to armor up, go out, and beat the tar out of people, which is what they're there for. War, we say war so often in the SCA that a lot of us who've been here a while understand that it is said completely absent of the modern 21st century highly negative, highly traumatic connotations that war brings with it. As I record this, I've just finished reading an article about some of the humanitarian situations coming out of the war in Ukraine. And when you stop and think about it, we use the word war very, very loosely in the SCA, and perhaps we need to remember that for some of our newer members, they don't have that frame of reference to go, "Oh, this is the word war in the SCA doesn't mean what it means when you open up the morning paper." That's a large part of why I wanted to make this video. Are there other types of events? Absolutely. Do other kingdoms break it down differently than Stiora does? I don't know that for a fact, but I would be shocked if they didn't. It seems like there are times where it seems like some kingdoms do things just so they can be different from everyone else. But I did want to talk about the SCA events, collegiums, and wars, because those are, at least in my area, at least in my kingdom, those are some of the most common phrases tossed around when talking about SCA events. And I wanted to highlight that. I wanted to let you guys know that that's what these mean, and that is, you know, that is why those phrases are used. So when we say war with a smile on our face and we're happy, and some people are like, God, that's a horrible thing to say. Well, for those of you who've been here a while, remember, not everyone fully understands SCA context, so it might be worth it to just keep that in mind. If anyone's looking at you funny, you can explain that to them. And for those of you who have just joined and you're hearing us talk about war and start frothing at the mouth, I used to fight. I get to make those jokes. Understand it's a word, and when we use it, it has very different connotations than what you see in the morning paper. So that's what I have. That's what I have. I'm hoping that answers some questions. I'm also hoping it prompts some conversation. I would love to know, how does your kingdom label events? What are the informal traditions for verbiage where you're at? You know, they talk about events, they talk about collegiums, they talk about wars. Do they have entirely different verbiages? Do they have different traditions? Are all events camping? Are all events day trip where you are? What's it like? Talk to me. Leave a comment down in the notes. But until then, I'll see you at the next event. Goodbye. God bless.